You've been talking about this and expecting this for quite a long time. Is this time frame important?
You know what? It's not important. It's actually pretty known. This is about the time that they start production. We think it's in the next couple of weeks. They've been tooling and kind of preparing for this for the last 3 or 4 months. But now is when they actually start production. If you're going to make 50 million, 40 million units a quarter core, you have to have a couple months of lead time. So this is the right time frame to start production.
Peter, in terms of your story, I know your sources aren't named, so I won't ask you to name them, but I wonder, in terms of the time frame, does this suggest a release in October or earlier?
You know, September time frame. It's sort of the typical release schedule for Apple. You know, what's new is that this is not just a speed bump. It's not just, you know, fingerprint reader. It's a new screen size, and the larger screen size is really one of the key things that people want.
Yeah, clearly we've seen a lot of success with that. I noticed people when they're on the train or something, everyone kind of looks over at the giant screens. But you didn't mention in your story a 4-inch screen. Do you expect them to do that as well?
I would expect so. We have not been able to confirm that, but I think the assumption is that they will. They're obviously selling a whole lot of those, and it would be kind of nuts to walk away from that market entirely.
Brian, let me ask you in terms of... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. What they're actually going to do is we believe they are going to keep the they're going to do this 4.7-inch screen. They're going to do a 5.5-inch screen. That's going to be more of the phablet product. They are going to keep the 5S on the production line, and they're going to keep the 5 on the production line. But we don't believe they continue to make the 4S anymore. We believe that product actually goes away with this next product cycle.
The 4S, but the 4-inch screen as well, gone?
The 4-inch screen, the 4-inch screen is actually what you see right now on the 5 and 5S, so that will remain. But the older 4S, right, which was still on that smaller 3.5-inch screen, that goes away completely.
Oh, got it. So I wonder, in terms of bill of materials, I mean, what does this really mean for the cost of the phone and the development? We know that the costs and a lot of the components tend to drop, but the glass and the battery costs maybe don't drop as much, Brian.
Absolutely, especially the screen. The screen will definitely be more expensive, but the good thing for Apple is that a lot of the key components will still be the same, and so those will have declined in price over the last year. I typically think about semiconductor price erosion at about 15 to 20% a year. That can change with volume, but those are going down. But the cost of the glass definitely more expensive, particularly on the 5.5-inch. One of the big questions is, will Apple charge more for that? We've seen this $199, $299, $399 pricing for a number of years now. One of the things I'm wondering is, do they raise that price of the entry-level 5.5-inch product, whatever they end up calling it? And I think there's a great possibility of that because of the higher price point.
Peter, what do we know about the sort of a market for these phones? Not just sort of where they could sell them, but where people are in terms of contracts, where, particularly in the U.S., the upgrade cycle is waiting to come next? Well,
I mean, there's clearly just a lot of demand for these larger phones. So I think this is a big enough change in the product line that a lot of people are going to move up. I mean, in Asia, 40% of Android phones are of this 4.7 or larger screen size.
Really?
Yeah, and I think IDC's numbers are something like 5-inch and higher is expected to grow 30% a year going forward, whereas slight decline in overall smartphone growth for smaller form factors.
Interesting. Brian, you were going to say?
And this is a critical point here, because Samsung has been the number one global player in mobile smartphone volume for a number of years now. And part of that reason is because Samsung decided to take a direction in doing these larger screens, which really seemed kind of silly to a lot of people at the time. But it turns out this is what consumers have really wanted for the last several years. We've seen that. You mentioned this 40% number in China. Everywhere I go in the world, I see people using the larger screens. So Apple's been kind of behind in this regard, but this is a really critical piece of their strategy, and I think it's going to be important to their volumes in the back half of the year, because a lot of people don't want these smaller screen sizes. So Apple is going to see, I think, a big surge in demand, internationally because of these new screen sizes, and I think they're going to topple Samsung in some of these markets as a result, because they're now competing with these comparable screen sizes.
Peter, why does it take Apple so long to make these? I mean, the phones, look, it's an absolute marvel in every way, but so is the Galaxy.
Right.
Why does it take Apple so much longer than Samsung to come up with a new design to make these kinds of changes that the market's already responding and saying that it wants?
Well, I mean, I think that Apple's got some sort of sacred cows that from the Steve Jobs era. I mean, honestly, he always was very vociferous about the fact that the smaller screen size was the right size, that the portability was more important than, the ability to have a big screen. It's kind of like the music subscription thing, that it took them a long time to get past this notion that people wanted to own their music, and I think that to some degree it's a cultural thing. I
agree. We saw the same thing. We saw the same thing with the iPad as well. That's a great point. We saw the same thing with the iPad. They said for a while, we don't believe in the 7-inch screen. We think it's too big to compete with the smartphone, too small to compete with the 10-inch iPad. And then a couple of years later, we saw it in the market because they saw there was consumer demand for it. So your points are right on. I agree with you.
Nonetheless, I'm hoping we're going to see some Samsung ads making fun of them having made such a commitment to the smaller phone, with the particular ad showing the size of the hand matching the size of the phone. Brian, is there crow to be eaten here?
You know what? I think there is a little bit because Apple is definitely being reactive in this regard, and a lot of people have expected, including myself, would have expected Apple to address this segment of the market for a while. I mean, every time, even the Note 3, which is very large it's about 5.7 inches. They sold 10 million units of that in the first 60 days. And Apple's really, I think, ignored that. So there is a little crow to be eaten because this is reactive by Apple. But Apple doesn't always have to move first. They just have to do it eventually and address consumer demand. And I think they're going to be successful with this.